Hello and welcome back to episode 3, Colour. In this episode, together, we're going to look at the ways you can manipulate and improve the colour in your images. There are many different ways to enhance the colour in your images inside Lightroom. You can do this from the tint and the temperature, the saturation, the vibrance, and then going more in depth to camera calibration and into the HSL sliders where you can manipulate each of the colours, saturation, hue and luminosity individually. As in the last tutorial, a lot of colour manipulation is personal preference, experience and your own creative idea as to how you want to take a photograph. So what we're going to do is take you through all the skills and techniques inside Lightroom in order for you to manipulate the colour in your images. Let's get to it. So welcome back to the PC, and we're going to go over the 4 different ways you can modify colour in Lightroom. We're going to go from the most general and global ways you can edit colour in an image to the most specific ways you can edit colour in Lightroom. So the first 2 ways that you can modify colour are here in the Basics tab. So we're looking at the general colour temperature and colour tint, which work together to define the colour of the entire image, how warm or cold an image might be using the temperature, and the tint, whether it might be more green or more purple. Now, as standard, you get an automatic as shot level from your camera of what it thinks the correct white balance should be, or you can then go and pick this by trying to go auto, or by clicking on the white balance selector and then selecting an area of the image which should be white. There's not always a section of the image, so that's why you can go and manually set it to what you think looks as it was at the time. But it's also a nice way to add creative colour into the document. So you can warm it up a little bit if you want a little bit more of a sunny warm vibe, or cool it down if you want it to feel colder, and you can complement those with the tint. So normally if you're making something look a little bit sunnier and a little bit warmer, you want to add a little bit to the tint as well towards the purple in order to complement it and not get a weird strange greeny colour that you can especially get sometimes in sunsets. So for this one I'm going to leave this on. The auto looks a bit cold. Let's go for as shot looks about right. The next 2 are vibrance and saturation. So they do kind of the same thing but affect different colours. So the best way to think about it is vibrance would be what you would use if someone is in the shot, and saturation is what you would use if someone isn't in the shot, because they both amplify the saturation of colours, but the vibrance slider does it less so for warmer colours such as orange and yellows. Now this is really useful if you were to be looking at the saturation with people in an image, because it means you can increase the colour without making them look bright orange. But it's also really useful in other edits because it doesn't have quite as notable an effect, especially in sunset shots where using saturation could just blow everything out and make it look so orange it looks unrealistic. So in this particular image, if we turn up the saturation, you can see these greens, especially in the background, are really overly vivid and overly fake, and you get this kind of radioactive looking grass. Whereas if I turn up the saturation a bit more, you still get this effect but not quite as much. It just looks more vibrant, as the slider is called, without going for the radioactive look that you get from the increased saturation of the oranges using the saturation tab. So for this image I'm just going to bump it up a little bit to about 20. Now the next most general but more specific colour modification you can get is one that a lot of people don't know about or don't use too much, and that's called camera calibration. So that is down at the bottom of your list on the right hand side of Lightroom here, and when you open that up you get hue and saturation sliders for your reds, greens and blues. So what these do is they affect the reds in all of the colours over the image, the blues in all the colours over the image, or the greens in all the colours over the image, and can either change the hue of these, so make the blues more aqua, more light blue, or darker and more purpley. You can do the same with the greens, from yellowy to more to the other end of the spectrum, and the reds, which go from pink to orange. You can also then change the saturation. So this changes the saturation of the reds throughout the entire image. So not just the colour red that you can see in the image, but the reds in the greens and the amount of red in the browns, for example. The other thing that you then have in this calibration slider is the shadows slider. So in here you can put either greens or purples into the shadows. So this will affect the darker areas of the image more as opposed to the lighter areas. So it's a nice way to get a bit of colour contrast into the image. So if you're going to have an example of this now, so we'll look at the sliders thing to start with, and this is already quite a green image, so this won't have too much of an impact. But as you can see, some of these areas in the dark ones start getting greener, and overall the image gets greener, as opposed to if you swap it over to purple, you can see some of that green is starting to come away as the shadows overall in the entire image get this purple colour, which is adding some contrast in this one. So now for an example of what the sliders do. So looking at this, it's not just the reds that are changing. As you can see, despite the fact I'm changing reds, these greens are going more yellow, as opposed to, if I take it the other way, they go back to a more neutral green and don't have quite the orangey tones in that they did before. You can also see it's affecting the browns, and the saturation will do the same thing. It will add more reds into the whole image or take a lot of the reds away, which, as you can see, because it's a sunset shot, there's lots and lots of reds throughout the image, so it desaturates it quite a lot. Now the classic way of editing with this is to bump up the blue primary. Although this does add a lot of blue into the sky, we can change that later. It also adds a lot to the image, kind of adds a lot of saturation to the image without being quite as powerful as the saturation slider. And then is to pull the hue on the blue to the left. Now this works really well with sunset shots and gets you the really Instagrammy aqua blue sky and more orangey brown sunset. But in this image, with all the trees, it takes us away from this standard green look and takes us more towards this almost autumnal or really sun-kissed look that we're going for in this sunset shot. And I'm quite happy with that. What you can now see in this image is there's obviously some really oversaturated blues in the sky, mostly from bringing up the saturation on the blue primary slider. But also there's a few other bits that we might want to change. Now the way we're going to do this is by going to the final way of modifying colour in Lightroom, which is the HSL or colour sliders. You can find these again on the right, and you can do the same thing in either HSL or colour, but it just lays out the same sliders in a different format. What this area allows you to do is modify the hue, the saturation and the luminance of each colour individually. Now it does this at a more specific level than the camera calibration did, by which it only edits anything that looks red on the page as opposed to all the red throughout the entire image. The hue allows us to change the colour of that colour, so it allows us to shift yellows to be more orange or to be more green, the two colours on either side of it on the spectrum. The saturation allows us to add more colour into the colour, so add more saturation, and the luminance is basically a brightness slider for individual colours. So firstly we'll look at the hue, and I want to take these yellows in the image and turn them a little bit more orangey. I then also want to get the greens and pull them to the right and make them a bit greener, a bit less orange, to add a bit of differentiation. And then I'm going to go into the saturation, and this is where I'm going to deal with that overly blue sky. So I'm going to pull the blue and the aqua all the way out the image, so you can now see this is white. I'm also going to boost up a bit the oranges to make it a bit more orange, and then some of the magentas and reds so we can pick out these flowers a little bit more. Finally, we're going to luminance. We'll add a little bit more brightness to this sky. So even though the blues have been desaturated, it still knows they are blue, and so I can add lightness or pull them all the way down and make them weirdly dark. So in that way I'm going to lift this up just a little bit to take even more of the colour out. I'm going to lift some of the oranges up a little bit to add a bit more separation, and then I'm going to darken some of the reds, purples and magentas. So we can see from that how powerful and how specific you can be with some of the colours in Lightroom. The one thing you can't do is edit colours in a specific area of the image unless you're doing adjustment layers, and then you can only edit the tint or the temperature. So the best way to do that is when we take the image into Photoshop. But just from a purely Lightroom point of view, you can see quite how much of an impact that has on the image. So we can go and take these off. So if we take the HSL slider, the last thing we did, you can see how that's changed the colours that I did. Then we add the blues back into the image. The camera calibration had a massive impact because that was changing all the blues throughout the image. And then in the basics tab, we can take the vibrance back down to where it was. And then you can see the difference that we've got on the entire image without changing any of the brightness settings, just using colour. So that was episode 3, colour, and that was also the end of Lightroom. Next episode, we're going to go on to episode 4, which is cleanup. And that's where we're going to go into Photoshop and start removing all the things from an image that are distractions. So these could be people, items on the floor, birds. We're also going to start looking at removing haloing, which are the white areas around the outside of buildings in particular that we talked about in the develop episode. And we're also going to be looking at an easy way to get rid of dust spots on your images. See you there. Nothing has happened. There are no crows or bees or slippery surfaces. Sorry.